Hello, I'm Dr. William Schlosser. You know me as an economist. You may also know me as an ecologist. But more than anything, you're going to know me as an educator. I'm Dr. Bill, and I welcome you to my classroom. Welcome to Chapter 4, Externalities, Environmental Policy, and Public Goods. In this chapter, we'll uncover how economic activities can impact the environment and society, often beyond what's accounted for in private transactions. We begin with a powerful example of the Bunker Hill Superfund site in Kellogg, Idaho, a stark case of a negative externality where decades of mining left severe environmental damage, affecting air, water, and community health. But there's another side of externalities. Consider honeybees. While producing the honey we love, their pollination services benefit farmers and the wider economy as a positive externality. We'll also examine how governments craft policies to mitigate negative impacts and enhance positive outcomes. For instance, energy production policies often include subsidies to incentivize cleaner technologies and foster public goods like sustainable power sources. Through these examples, we'll explore the critical interplay between economics, environmental policy, and the public interest. Let's dive in and discover the real-world applications of these concepts. Externalities occur when an economic activity impacts third parties who are not directly involved in the transaction. These impacts can be positive, creating benefits, or negative, imposing costs. For example, education often generates positive externalities by increasing societal productivity, while pollution creates negative externalities by harming public health. Importantly, externalities extend beyond monetary considerations. They reflect broader societal impacts. However, understanding their financial implications is crucial because these costs or benefits can distort market outcomes. We will explore how these ideas play out. In economics, externalities represent a disconnect between private transactions and societal outcomes. Positive externalities occur when the benefits of an action spill over to others, such as vaccinations preventing disease spread. Conversely, negative externalities arise when costs, like pollution, are imposed on others without compensation. While these effects may not always show up directly in financial statements, they have real economic impacts. Quantifying externalities, whether as costs or benefits, allows policymakers to design interventions that can address market failures and improve overall efficiency. Externalities disrupt the balance of economic efficiency. In an efficient market, resources are allocated to maximize societal well-being. However, negative externalities, like pollution, lead to overproduction, as producers don't bear the full societal costs of their activities. Similarly, positive externalities, such as education, result in underproduction because the benefits extend beyond the individual consumer. Addressing these inefficiencies often requires policies like taxes, subsidies, or regulations to realign incentives and ensure that market outcomes better reflect societal values. To understand the real-world implications of externalities, we turn to the Bunker Hill Superfund remediation site. This case highlights the devastating effects of negative externalities, such as lead contamination, on a community. While workers like Ava Sullivan entered agreements with the company, the broader societal costs, especially the health impacts on her children, were externalized, affecting those who did not consent or benefit from the transactions. This example underscores the importance of recognizing and addressing externalities to protect public health and promote fairness in economic activities. As we talk of natural resource commodity externalities, I give some examples centered in northern Idaho. In a microeconomics course, you learn about both positive and negative externalities and what that means both from an economic standpoint and from what has become a monumental human health problem. We are headed to the Silver Valley of Idaho, up the Coeur d'Alene River, through Kellogg and Wallace. This area is currently the home of the world-class ski mountain called Silver Mountain Resort. In the late 1880s, a boom in mining activity in Idaho's Silver Valley followed the concentration of railroad lines through what was previously considered by European Americans to be inaccessible wilderness. Silver Mountain became the largest iron smelting facility in the world. This area was known as a center of extensive silver and other metal mining and processing. Commercial mining and processing efforts resulted in extensive contamination of water, land, and air, endangering residents of the Coeur d'Alene Indian tribe, which had traditionally depended on fish from the waterways as part of its subsistence. The unanticipated complication came from lead poisoning from iron smelting operations, contaminating water and the air of the region. We now step into 1979 to hear from one of the Bunker Hill workers, Ava Sullivan.
Lead, silver, and zinc are all mined here in Kellogg, Idaho. The main employer in Kellogg is the Bunker Hill Company. Over 1,500 people work at Bunker Hill's mine and smelting complex. Eva Sullivan is a working mother employed at the lead smelter. She has been active in her union, the United Steelworkers, in the long fight for stricter controls on lead. Prior to this interview, the level of lead in her blood was so high that Eva had to be transferred out of the smelter. Being leaded, as the workers call it, is an everyday fact of life in Kellogg.
This is the Bunker Hill smelter, and this area right directly behind us is the fuming plant, and that's where I normally work. But I was transferred to the zinc plant in July for lead. Even at the zinc plant, there's lead areas. And the area I'm working in now is a non-lead area. But we have another department that's above us, and we get the smoke coming down on us. And it's just if you work in this place, unless you're working underground or at the concentrator, to some extent everybody works in the lead. I didn't even realize that I was leaded until after I was taken out of it. Because for some reason, the month after you're out of it, that's when you feel the worst.
A new federal rule will limit worker exposure to lead, but women at Bunker Hill suffer other indignities besides lead poisoning. The company admits that the plant's high lead levels could harm a pregnant woman. Their solution? Sterilization.
You have to be either surgically sterilized or unable to bear children to work in a lead area. I mean, this is a company decision, and I don't think there's been any federal decision on this, but this has been a company decision after they found out some lead facts, and they just will not allow women that can bear children inside a lead area. And I'm still upset about that. I think it should be my decision. You know, it shouldn't be that they say, well, you cannot work there if you're not surgically sterilized, or, you know, we have to bring in a slip from the doctor saying we are surgically unable to bear children. This is the only place I can make any money in this valley. I have a high school education. If I go to waiting tables, I'm not going to make nearly the money, have nearly the benefits that I do now. I have no idea of women's libs. I would like to see Bunker Hill become a better place for women to work and more women being hired there. I think they should have their fair chance to at least try it.
Lead can cause reproductive problems, but it affects both men and women. A retired smelter worker thinks the company should clean up the plant, not clear out the women.
The company transferred them all out because they supposedly got scared of the big rumor that if they become pregnant, it would affect the offspring. And they transferred them just bang to the mine, zinc plant, or wherever, regardless of seniority, regardless of anything else. Well, some of us that were on the safety committee and in working in the union says, well, if it's hazardous for women, it's certainly hazardous for men also. And information that's been coming to us is showing that this is a fact. For instance, there's an article in Science News on how it affects the fertility of men.
Other companies have policies similar to Bunker Hill's. 5 West Virginia women recently had themselves sterilized in order to keep their jobs.
Many of the mine tailings were dumped directly into the Coeur d'Alene River and its tributaries, which became polluted with high levels of sulfur dioxide, lead, and other metals. In 1973, a stack cleaner accident damaged how the smelter cleaned contaminants from the smokestack. Bunker Hill Mining Company's management decided to continue operations even though the stack spewed toxic lead, cadmium, and zinc into the air around the smelter. Winds carried the contaminants across the valley for miles. By 1974, the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality tested blood lead levels in local children to find the highest lead contamination ever recorded anywhere in the world. Approximately 26% of the 2-year-olds in the region had dangerously high levels of lead in their blood, which had long-term negative consequences for their health, especially intellectual functioning and achievement. Once poisoned, the effects are not reversible. Only further contamination can be prevented. The water in rivers turned opaque gray and brown, earning this stream the nickname Lead Creek. An estimated 100 million tons of arsenic, cadmium, and zinc were released into the air, along with 30,000 tons of lead. As of 2015, about $865 million of cleanup costs had been spent. But the end is not yet in sight. This is a huge Idaho example of a negative externality. It reaches far beyond the cleanup costs mentioned here. It captured the health and safety of people, including the women who were surgically sterilized and the children who experienced loss of appetite, abdominal pain, vomiting, weight loss, constipation, anemia, kidney failure, irritability, lethargy, learning disabilities, and behavioral problems. Slow development of normal childhood behaviors, such as talking and use of words, and permanent intellectual disability were commonly seen and documented. Bunker Hill Mine closed in 1982, and by 1983, the Bunker Hill Smelter was added to the National Priorities List as a Superfund remediation site by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. As of 2007, the EPA had spent $200 million attempting to remediate the site, much of which was spent removing contaminated topsoil from residential areas. The state of Idaho had also spent funds since the early 1980s on cleanup. While there were measurable improvements in environmental conditions, a vast amount of cleanup and restoration was still required. I was hired in 2007 as a consultant for TerraGraphics Environmental Engineering, Inc. of Moscow, Idaho, who began providing the service of contaminated site cleanup for the Idaho DEQ and EPA in 1983. They were there from the start of cleanup efforts. With a main office in Kellogg, TerraGraphics had identified contaminated sites, developed remediation protocols, and made measurable differences in threat exposure to residents of the region. I assisted the company's efforts by managing their geospatial analysis record-keeping and mapping, database interactions, environmental science connectivity between engineers and field staff, and reporting protocols to the Idaho DEQ and U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I also led the effort to prepare a hazard mitigation plan for Shoshone County, for the Federal Emergency Management Agency to articulate the costs of a natural disaster like flooding on the remediated lands along the Coeur d'Alene River Valley. Potential costs of the mining disaster would last for centuries. Bunker Hill mining operations make an obvious example of a negative externality. But we need to be able to identify and quantify lesser causes and also positive externalities we encounter. A first reaction might be to conclude no pollution is the best answer. But really, not many of us are ready to give up our polluting ways, like driving a gas-powered car or turning on the natural gas heater at home. Yep, those are polluters, and we really do not want to give up our personal pollution contributions. We are economists, so we will work out the numbers on this topic to figure out how to best manage this balance. A few details are needed for us to really get into these discussions about externalities. First, they are called spillover effects by some because their impacts are not anticipated by some market participants and because they become the ones left holding the bag. Or in this case, the ones who end up paying for the costs of the negative things happening from somebody else's production and consumption. A pivotal point to remember is that externalities are always something happening to someone who is outside the transaction. The logger is paid a wage to perform logging duties while that logger accepts risks associated with the occupation, like debris falling from the harvested tree or logs shifting in the log deck the logger is walking over. If the logger is injured while on the job, that person is not experiencing a negative externality. The logger and the operator are both parties engaged in the transaction. Employees often accept occupational risks and are compensated for those risks. Workers' compensation insurance fills the void to cover the medical costs of on-the-job injuries, not negative externalities. If we can anticipate negative externalities of our actions, it is possible to structure cost and price exchanges to cover those unanticipated outcomes. It is not too difficult to anticipate water pollution happening because of a processing activity that makes a good for a customer. If you can anticipate the pollution, you can predict the costs of remediating it to incorporate those costs into the price of the product. Failure to account for these events leads to a market failure, and the burden of your activities is shifted to someone outside the transaction. Generally, your lawyer will be involved soon enough to assist you in your after-the-fact remediation efforts. That will cost more than the pre-event planning and prevention. I have been focused on negative externalities so far, but positive externalities are also seen. It is the beekeeper who keeps bees to make honey, while the tree orchard next door gets free pollination. It is the first aid training workers receive, who then saves the life of another fisherman while on the Salmon River. Taking this closer to home, your increased education can lead to a broader society benefits in the form of greater economic productivity, a lower unemployment rate, greater household mobility, and higher rates of political participation. Yep, you and me are involved in this educational transaction, but the positive externality benefits are the rest of the country, even the rest of the world. I am holding up my end of the bargain. Now it's your turn. You made it this far, so there's no turning back. An externality is a benefit or cost that affects someone who is not directly involved in the production or consumption of a good or service. In the case of air pollution, there is a negative externality because people with asthma, for example, may bear a cost even though they were not involved in buying or selling of the electricity generation of which caused the pollution. Medical research is an example of a positive externality because people who are not directly involved in producing it or paying for it can benefit. We like our electricity, right? Of course we do. You are using it right now to watch this video. We are the buyers of it, and there are sellers of electricity making a living to produce this scarce resource to people and businesses who want it. We are studying economics, so we could make supply and demand curves to diagram it. But for now, I want you to think in terms of marginal costs of making more electricity and our marginal benefits from consuming more. Electricity production is big business. From coal-burning plants making it with its high carbon dioxide emissions and acid rain pollution, to hydroelectric dams that blocks migrating salmon from their spawning grounds. We can consider solar, wind, nuclear, and even biomass electricity generation options to realize each method carries its own private and social cost burdens. Because utilities do not bear the cost of acid rain, they produce electricity beyond the economically efficient level. Supply curve S1 represents just the marginal private cost that the utility has to pay. Supply curve S2 represents the marginal social cost, which includes the costs to those affected by acid rain. Again, we are shifting the supply curve up, like we did for taxes. Recognize right away how the efficient quantity has decreased, while the efficient price is higher than the market that did not consider the marginal social cost. If the supply curve were S2 rather than S1, market equilibrium would occur at price P efficient and the quantity Q efficient, the economically efficient level of output. But when the supply curve is S1, the market equilibrium occurs at price P market and quantity Q market, where there is a deadweight loss equal to the area of the yellow triangle. Because of the deadweight loss, this equilibrium is not efficient. A competitive market achieves economic efficiency by maximizing the sum of consumer and producer surpluses. But that result holds only if there are no externalities in production or consumption. An externality causes a difference between the private cost of production and the social cost, or the private benefit from consumption and the social benefit. The private cost is the cost borne by producer of a good or service. The social cost is the total cost of producing a good or service, including both the private cost and any external cost. The private benefit is the benefit received by the consumer of a good or service. The social benefit is the total benefit from consuming a good or service, including both the private benefit and any external benefit. When there is a negative externality in the production of a good or service, too much of the good or service will be produced at market equilibrium. When there is a positive externality in consuming a good or service, too little of the good or service will be produced at market equilibrium. Let's bring this back to you, a student in this class. People who do not consume college educations can still benefit from it. As a result, the marginal social benefit from a college education is greater than the marginal private benefit to college students. Because only the marginal private benefit is represented in the market demand curve, D1, the quantity of college educations produced, Q market, is too low. If the market demand curve were D2 instead of D1, the level of college educations produced would be Q efficient, which is the efficient level. At the market equilibrium of Q market, there is a deadweight loss equal to the area of the yellow triangle. You might think of this deadweight loss as a measurement of the benefits from the education not received. We can lump these situations into the category of market failures. It does not matter if it is a negative or positive externality. If there are externalities, the market equilibrium will not accurately account for these cases. The bigger the externality, the bigger the failure. Think of Bunker Hill as the largest Superfund site ever experienced in the country.
In the snows of North Dakota, they were digging in for the long haul. This camp is the largest gathering of Native Americans in living memory. They had come here to fight a pipeline which they say desecrated sacred sites and threatened tribal waters. The £3 billion pipeline is almost complete, apart from a short section under the Missouri. Energy Transfer Partners insists its project is safe and legal. Now, though, the US Army has decided not to grant permission for that final stretch, saying alternate routes should be explored. In recent weeks, there have been bloody clashes between protesters and the authorities. Supporters of the pipeline fret that such violence may have helped their opponents win their argument. President-elect Donald Trump is in favor of the project, and Republicans here say the Army's decision is a chilling signal for the future of US infrastructure. But the tribes here now feel that months of struggle has paid off, and the local Standing Rock Sioux people have praised the historic decision. James Cook, BBC News.
Imperfect administration of property rights resides at the core of externality problems. I am applying the term property right beyond just the idea of an acre of land owned by someone to encompass prevention of air pollution, the air we all breathe. It includes potential dumping of contaminants from an oil pipeline into a river system running through Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. The protesters in North Dakota did not state it this way, but their position has been to force the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Energy Transfer Partners to internalize the negative effects of the potential externalities potentially borne by the Sioux tribe, a group who is not part of the transaction. Deal with it before it makes non-repairable damages. Although government intervention may increase economic efficiency in markets where externalities are present, it is possible for people to find private solutions to the problems of externalities. Ronald Coase made this argument in a 1960 article. To understand Coase's argument, it is important to understand that completely eliminating an externality is usually not economically efficient. If the reduction of sulfur dioxide emissions is at 7 million tons per year, the marginal benefit of $250 per ton is greater than the marginal cost of $175 per ton. Further reductions in emissions will increase the net benefit to society. If the reduction of sulfur dioxide emissions is at 10 million tons, the marginal cost of $225 per ton is greater than the marginal benefit of $150 per ton. reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions will increase the net benefit to society. Only when the reduction is at 8.5 million tons is the marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. This level is the economically efficient level of pollution reduction. Increasing the reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions from 7 million tons to 8.5 million tons results in total benefits equal to the sum of areas A and B under the marginal benefit curve. The total cost of this reduction in pollution is equal to the area of B under the marginal cost curve. The total benefits are greater than the total costs by an amount equal to the area of A. Because the total benefits from reducing pollution are greater than the total costs, it is possible for those receiving the benefits to arrive at a private agreement with polluters to pay them to reduce pollution. This delivers us into the global topic of climate change and carbon sequestration. Sequestration efforts involve benefits to everyone in the world and logically would include payments for the efforts from everyone in the world. That is a double tough proposal because collecting payment from everyone in the world carries a super high transaction cost. Now you know why attempts to address this issue has anchored on global agreements. There are frequently practical difficulties in the way of a private solution to the problem of externalities. For example, if many people suffer from the negative effects of pollution, bringing all the victims together with all producers of the pollution to negotiate an agreement often fails due to high transaction costs. Transaction costs are the cost in time and other resources that parties incur in the process of agreeing to and carrying out an exchange of goods and services. Ronald Coase pointed out that the amount of pollution reduction will be the same whether polluters or the victims of pollution are legally liable for damages. Bargaining between the parties will result in the same reduction in pollution, where the marginal benefit of the last unit of reduction is equal to the marginal cost. Remember, when we discuss externalities, we focus on possible effects felt by parties not part of the transaction. The logger who accepted risks of logging when negotiating compensation is not facing potential externalities. The farmer owning the stream and associated property rights to the stream when negotiating with the paper mill will be able to settle an agreement about pollution into the stream. A poor negotiation may be entered, but it would be a failed negotiation, not an externality. My family is a big consumer of raw honey. Amber and buckwheat are our favorites. We buy about 6 gallons a year to add to our chai, breakfast oatmeal, and to a teaspoon of raw garlic each morning. We made it a point to get to know local beekeepers located in Lewiston and Moscow. They travel the western states to deliver their hives to paying farmers to pollinate apple orchards, cherries, plums, almonds, melons, raspberries, and so much more. The growers get their crops pollinated, while the beekeepers make their honey. Growers pay the beekeepers to deliver the hives on a set schedule, coordinated with the seasons. It makes their crops more predictable. The beekeepers migrate the hives to attend to other locations to follow the bloom. It makes honey harvests consistently productive. There are loads of costs and benefits for each participant of the transaction. Notice that? Where once bees were positive externality for the growers and perfectly timed blooms were a positive externality to the beekeeper, The Coase theorem articulated how both could benefit by making the event an integrated transaction that internalizes the externalities. What a great solution! Recently, we talked about the deadweight loss because of a market that operates off balance of equilibrium. The bigger the deadweight loss, the bigger participants' consumption of surpluses in the market. Externalities can be measured the same way. In this case, the deadweight loss is measured by calculating how transactions would have efficiently been measured if the parties excluded from the transaction had actually been incorporated into it. A new optimal level of consumption is identified with the new price level. The shift in the supply curve identifies where that deadweight loss is found. Because utilities do not bear the cost of acid rain, they produce electricity beyond the economically efficient level. If the government imposes a tax equal to the cost of acid rain, the utilities will internalize the externality. As a consequence, the supply curve will shift up from S1 to S2. The market equilibrium quantity changes from Q market, where an inefficiently high level of electricity is produced, to Q efficient, the economically efficient equilibrium quantity. The price of electricity will rise from P market, which does not include the cost of acid rain, to P efficient, which does include the cost. Consumers pay the price, P efficient, while producers receive the price, P, which is equal to P efficient minus the amount of the tax. We look into the category of perpetual natural resources to see geothermal, solar, and hydro energy. Solar power is a banner carrier of this category. Overall, electricity production is big business, from coal-burning plants emitting high carbon dioxide levels to the atmosphere and acid rain pollution, to hydroelectric dams along the Columbia River that block migrating salmon from their natal spawning grounds. We use those power supplies in ever-increasing amounts. We also consider solar, wind, nuclear, and even biomass electricity generation options to realize each method carries its own private and social cost burdens. We know that rational people respond to taxes, regulations, and incentives that influence their decisions. Negative externalities catch the attention of people investigating the need to correct a wrong, that is, penalizing folks who are not part of the transaction. But what about a positive externality? Can those be taxed into existence? The reverse of a tax is an incentive, a subsidy. We have heard the benefits of solar and wind energy and how these forms of power generation do not create carbon dioxide emissions, create acid rain, or lead to global climate change. So, why not subsidize creators of positive externalities? I introduce you to Bill Camp, Living Off the Grid.
When you're as plugged in as this, you'd think the electricity bill would go through the roof. But this homeowner never pays an electric bill, ever.
There you go.
That's because Bill Kemp has his very own power supply, a system of solar panels that keeps his home, located just outside Ottawa, Canada, running just like yours and mine. It's called living off the grid. Yep, that means Bill Kemp doesn't rely on electricity from any utility company to power his home. He's completely independent. Now, when you hear the words off-gridder, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I'm betting you didn't picture this. I gotta be honest, I honestly thought, I pictured a guy out in the woods,
big beard,
kind of like that, frying a raccoon over a Bunsen burner. Bill, an energy consultant and best-selling author of the Renewable Energy Handbook, and his wife Lorraine are one of an estimated 180,000 families living in off-grid homes in North America today.
So this is going to be my first taste of solar brewed
Solar-brewed
cup of cappuccino.
Cappuccino, yep.
Bill's journey began on the grid. He and Lorraine wanted to move, but they found out it would cost a small fortune to bring electric lines in. So they decided instead to invest that money into building a new home off the grid.
Well, a lot of people thought that we were just plain crazy. Lorraine was very supportive. Her question was, can I still run my hairdryer? And I said, absolutely, I guarantee that.
That was 20 years ago, and they've never looked back. 2 large rotating solar arrays track the sun every 90 seconds, each array generating over 1,000 watts of energy, enough to run a large appliance.
How do you go from the sun billions of miles away? How does that thing run your hairdryer in the morning?
Okay, well, it's really very simple. The sunlight comes in and hits these photovoltaic panels. These are like great big integrated circuits on steroids.
The sunlight charges a bank of batteries in Bill's basement, feeds into an inverter, a device that converts the energy into normal household power, then flows through the home.
And then into your electrical devices, the hairdryer.
Long after the sun goes down, the charged batteries keep the lights on and anything else Bill needs well into the night. On a cloudy day, a 1,500-watt wind turbine picks up the slack. And in case of Armageddon or a spell of gray skies and no wind, a backup half biodiesel, half diesel generator kicks in to charge up the batteries.
It would be pretty tough to lose power here.
Oh, and did I mention this living off the grid is pretty low maintenance? All Bill has to do is pour distilled water into the batteries about 2 to 3 times a year.
My uncle gets a colonoscopy more often than you check your batteries. So.
Bill and Lorraine Kemp say they're getting off the grid had its upfront costs, about $40,000 worth. For other homeowners, the cost really depends on how much electricity you think you need to live comfortably.
It's a small price to pay for a life unplugged. In other words, the good life. In Ontario, Canada, Patty Kim, Energy Now.
That is an incredible example Bill and Maureen Kemp deployed to capture off-grid energy creation while also eliminating negative externalities by using electricity generated at coal-burning plants, natural gas-burning furnaces, hydroelectric power dams, or other heavily loaded negative externality sources. Let's keep our attention focused on this type of a solution for other negative externality transactions we get involved with. People who do not consume college educations can benefit from them. As a result, the social benefit from a college education is greater than the private benefit to college students. If the government pays a subsidy equal to the external benefit, students will internalize the externality. The subsidy will cause the demand curve to shift up from D1 to D2. As a result, the market equilibrium quantity will shift from Q market, where an inefficiently low level of college educations are supplied, to Q efficient, the economically efficient equilibrium quantity. Producers receive the price P efficient, while consumers pay the price P, which is equal to P efficient minus the amount of the subsidy. When private solutions to externalities are not feasible, government can intervene to increase economic efficiency. A.C. Pigou argued that to deal with a negative externality in production, the government should impose a tax equal to the cost of the externality. Pigou argued that the government should deal with a positive externality in consumption by giving consumers a subsidy equal to the value of the externality. Pigovian taxes and subsidies are government taxes and subsidies intended to bring about an efficient level of output in the presence of externalities. These taxes and subsidies internalize the externalities. In Bill and Maureen Kemp's situation, it would have involved providing them a subsidy equal to the cost of abating global climate change caused by other power source emissions plus environmental cleanup for acid rain and restoring anadromous fisheries to historic levels. Of course, it would be put in terms of the use of these two consumers of energy, so their share of the subsidy would be pretty small. But then, it works in the right direction. Internalizing the externality. Smoking cigarettes and drinking cases of soda are personal decisions, right? Why should anyone have the power to limit what I consume? Well, it turns out that the secondhand smoke, a mixture of smoke from the burning end of the cigarette and the smoke exhaled from the lungs of smokers, has negative externalities for the non-smoking third parties of the transactions. Sodas are sugar-sweetened, high-calorie carbonated beverages that, when consumed, lead to obesity, weight-related diseases, dental decay, hypokalemia, and bone density loss. With revised healthcare regulations in America as of 2010, we as a country are in shared healthcare cohorts. That means that your decision to drink sodas and smoke cigarettes will cost you more for healthcare, while also costing me more. We share the cost load of our unhealthy decisions. I am not part of your transaction to buy those smokes or to drink those sodas, but I am the one who bears the negative externality. Our supply and demand curve equilibrium reveals where the solidarity price and quantity are located. But a soda tax would reduce demand to indicate a new equilibrium quantity and taxed price. The reality check is to ask, what happens to the soda tax monies? That is a clincher question to explore. Just because a tax is levied, it does not mean the tax revenue will be spent to cover the costs of the negative externality. All too often, those tax dollars are diverted to other general fund purposes. Just reducing quantity demanded is not the same as capturing the costs to be applied to the negative externality event. A command and control approach to pollution is a policy that involves the government imposing quantitative limits on the amount of pollution firms are allowed to emit, or requiring firms to install specific pollution control devices. This was the initial approach taken in Kellogg, Idaho, with the smokestack filters located in the bag houses. When it caught fire and released pollutants into the air, it violated the command and control directives. But when the mining company continued operations without filtration, tons of pollutants were released to the detriment of everyone in the Silver Valley, then and now. Thinking about how firms implement control measures for things like pollution opens an interesting complication. For instance, Ford Motor Company designed their truck fleet in a way that recaptured much of the exhaust while still contained in the gas engine. By recombusting it, they can pass it through a low-cost scrubbing device, releasing low pollution level emissions out the exhaust pipe. At the same time, General Motors did not use the same design solutions initially. Their cost of pollution reduction is greater than Ford's costs to achieve a target level of acceptable pollution. The GM catalytic converter redesigned to reduce pollution would be costlier to achieve an acceptable level of pollution. If, on the other hand, politicians and bureaucrats mandate that all producers reduce their pollution emissions by a certain percent, like a 10% reduction, then Ford's ultimate target will be lower than GM's ultimate target. The lower producers make their emission reductions, the costlier it becomes. Ford would be penalized under such a scenario. Each situation has complications, and there really are no perfect penalties or subsidies. Shifting our focus from automobiles to power generation, instead of a command and control approach, Congress decided to use a cap and trade system of tradable emission allowances to deal with the problem of acid rain. The objective was to reduce emissions of sulfur dioxide to 8.5 million tons annually by 2010. The federal government gave electric utilities, the major source of sulfur dioxide emissions that cause acid rain, allowances equal to the total amount of tradable emissions. The utilities were then free to buy and sell the allowances. Utilities that could reduce their emissions at a low cost did so, and sold some or all of their pollution allowances to utilities that could reduce their emissions only at a relatively high cost. The program was successful not only in reducing emissions, but in doing so at a much lower cost than had been previously expected. Despite its success, the sulfur dioxide cap and trade system effectively ended in 2013. Research showed that illnesses caused by sulfur dioxide emissions were greater than previously had been thought. Although President George W. Bush proposed legislation to lower the cap on sulfur dioxide emissions, Congress did not pass the legislation. As a result, the Environmental Protection Agency reverted to selling limits on sulfur dioxide emissions at the state or power plant level. They went back to the command and control pollution management scenario. Some environmentalists have labeled tradable emission allowances as a license to pollute. But this criticism ignores a central economics lesson. Resources are scarce, and trade-offs exist. Resources spent reducing pollution are not available for any other use. Because reducing acid rain using allowances cost utilities $870 million rather than $7.4 billion, as originally estimated, society saved more than $6.5 billion per year. Solutions are complicated to really understand and apply, but it seems there are plenty of positive analysis economists out here to find these solutions and deploy their benefits. It is distressing to realize that government solutions that do not generate tax revenue are often passed over for other approaches. Part of this trade-off comes from what Ronald Coase articulated in the Coase theorem. If transaction costs are low, private bargaining will result in an efficient solution to the problem of externalities. It can be helpful and beneficial to solve complicated problems. If I want a pair of jeans, I will go to a clothing store, find a pair that suits me, and I will pay for them. They become my jeans, and no one else gets to use them. They are my private good, and my use of them excludes others from using them. My jeans are both rival and excludable. These two terms can be applied in 4 categories of all goods and services we consume. Goods and services can be divided into 4 categories on the basis of whether people can be excluded from consuming them and whether they are rival in consumption. A good or service is rival in consumption if one person consuming a unit of the good means that another person cannot consume that unit. Reason these out in your head. Think of the shoes you bought and know that when you bought them, they became your shoes, and thereby you excluded everyone else from buying them, while also establishing that no one else gets to wear them. Excludable, but also rival. Think of that salmon you caught on the Clearwater River. You had to compete for that fish against the other 10,000 fishermen near Dworshak Reservoir. But when you caught that legal fish and it became your rival salmon, your fish is non-excludable while it is rival. When you paid your monthly subscription for DSL Internet, it became your excludable connection to the web. But you getting online through it did not exclude anyone else from getting online with their own connection. It is excludable and non-rival. When we enjoy national defense, the court system, or even a great view of Mount Rainier, our enjoyment of the resource does not exclude anyone else from its enjoyment, and we cannot exclude them from it. It is non-excludable and non-rival at the same time. What is it? No, really, where does it land on the table we just looked at? It is super simple when I talk you through them, so here you are. Give me the category the sun fits into. Well, okay. The sun is a public good, meaning it is non-excludable and non-rival. Efficient markets happen in the production and consumption of private goods. Freedom of choice to make what I am good at making and consume what I want. It gets loads more difficult when we consider things like public goods. Do I really need to pay my taxes? That person wants to freeload on benefits from police protection, fire protection, national defense, and our legal system. Some people want to take those trees from the national forest without paying for them. They belong to all of us, right? Why should I have to pay for them? Another freeloader of the common resources available to everyone. This situation, the common resource issue, led to the tragedy of the commons known from Great Britain, where many farmers shared common pasture lands. Overgrazing was witnessed as more cattle were not penalized. Ultimately, the pasture lands were overgrazed, and recovery took several years to recapture sustainable production levels. Think about how, in current times, we managed this scenario in respect to deer and elk hunting or salmon and steelhead fishing in the Salmon and Clearwater rivers. First, recognize these as common resources, non-excludable and rival. Why is overharvesting a potential problem, and how do we manage these resources? We have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service dedicated to these resources. But as consumers of hunting and fishing regulations, we are adhering to rules to avoid that tragedy of the commons. The market demand curve for private goods is determined by adding horizontally the quantity of the good demanded at each price by each consumer. For instance, in Panel A, Jill demands 2 hamburgers when the price is $4, and in Panel B, Joe demands 4 hamburgers when the price is $4. So, a quantity of 6 hamburgers at a price of $4 is a point on the market demand curve in Panel C. To find the demand curve for a public good, we add up the price at which each consumer is willing to purchase each quantity of the good. In Panel A, Jill is willing to pay $8 per hour for a security guard to provide 10 hours of protection. In Panel B, Joe is willing to pay $10 for that same protection. Therefore, in Panel C, the price of $18 per hour and the quantity of 10 hours will be a point on the demand curve for security guard services. Recognize the differences you just saw. In Figure 5.8, we added the quantities together at the price point of $4 to see Jill's 2 burgers and Joe's 4 burgers, totaling 6, at a price point of $4. that $4 remained the price point where we found the additive quantities. In Figure 5.9, we looked at public goods to recognize the quantity was held constant, but costs were summed. Jill paid $8 for 10 hours of protection, while Joe paid $10 for the same service. If they can combine their needs into one security guard, and 10 hours of protection can be provided at the same time for the same area, then the guard would make $18 an hour. This really fits nicely to explain how countries provide national security and how counties operate sheriff departments. The optimal quantity of a public good is produced where the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximized, which occurs where the demand curve intersects the supply curve. In this case, the optimal quantity of security guard services is 15 hours at a price of $9 per hour. For a public good otherwise known as a common resource like firewood from a forest, the efficient use level, Q efficient, is found at the intersection of the demand curve, which represents the marginal benefit received by consumers, and S2, which represents the marginal cost of cutting the wood. Because each individual tree cutter ignores the external cost, the equilibrium quantity of firewood cut is Q actual, which is greater than the efficient quantity. At the actual equilibrium level of output, there is a deadweight loss, as shown by the yellow triangle. It seems I keep taking you back to the topic of property rights, broadly determined to include what is permitted as actions and what is recognized as ownership. The tragedy of the commons collapsed because of the lack of ownership of the land and policies that would protect the resource. Look into places where resource management is managed well, managed without salmon overharvest and without deer or elk overharvesting. Look at tribal wildlife management techniques. Reservations are a shadow of the area they were in time immemorial. The geographical area is limited and well defined. Tribal regulations establish social norms, commonly accepted practices, and regulations. Overharvest is not generally seen and reinvestment to the resource is made. At the tribal level, this works without the imposition of taxes, quotas, or tradable permits. Those traits are reserved for many dispersed consumers spread over vast jurisdictions, where the resource is scarce in respect to the consumption demands on them. Wildlife management in Africa has gone through some cascading declines of highly valued wildlife. European and Asian trophy hunters could legally enter the country to participate in the hunt of a lifetime, shoot a lion, elephant, rhino, or about any other trophy for the sport of it. Spending $10,000 for this hunt of a lifetime was big excitement for the hunter, but a fortune for the guides and their villages. This led to overharvesting of areas, regions, and ultimately, some of the trophy species. A few African countries applied an economics lesson to manage their scarce resources. They converted the common resource to a private good. Instantly, the game became valuable to the landowner to maintain at harvestable levels. Because wild animals were included as part of property rights, landowners captured the value of their resource. Now the landowners have incentive to support the species that brings them an income. It is most interesting to me that in Texas, landowners have owned the wildlife on their properties for over a century, and thereby have incentive to manage the wildlife populations as a resource protected by property rights, at least in the way we economists embrace the term. As we conclude this chapter, let's reflect on the critical lessons we've learned. Externalities, both positive and negative, play a central role in shaping the outcomes of economic activities. Take Eva Strand's story from the Bunker Hill video. She was a voluntary participant in her agreement with the mining company, no matter how shocking those terms seem today. But the true negative externality victims were the children of the Silver Valley, exposed to lead poisoning and lifelong developmental challenges. They did not enter into an agreement with the mining company, nor did the thousands of people living in the Silver Valley, including the Coeur d'Alene tribal members who lived along the river, hunting deer, elk, and moose, and collecting fish from the lakes and rivers, which are now contaminated by the mining wastes delivered as a negative externality for decades to come. This chapter taught us how to distinguish between voluntary transactions and the unintended spillover effects of third parties. We also explored the difference between positive analysis, which objectively identifies the costs of externalities, and normative analysis, which questions their fairness. Both approaches often lead to the same conclusion. Externalities can cause significant market failures. Ultimately, addressing these failures requires balancing economic growth with societal welfare. By understanding these trade-offs, we can propose solutions, like regulations or taxes, to internalize the costs of externalities and move closer to economic efficiency and justice.